Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Parent, the University of Notre Dame, for the Jervis Forum, doing the Frontiers of International Security. We're joined today with Professor Josh Busby. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to be talking about climate change and security. So, we're going to start out, as usual, by talking about what those things are, and then move on to what's exciting about them, what we know about them, and maybe offer some grounds for hope in a dark time when it comes to climate change. So, Josh, start us off. What are you talking about? What do you mean when you say climate change and security?
Well, climate change is alteration of the Earth's weather patterns through pollution. So we have made the Earth warmer and caused weird weather patterns through burning of fossil fuels. So that's what I mean when I talk about climate change. When we think about security, our traditional understanding is the risk of armed external attack by foreign invaders. But climate change is different. And so we've expanded our understanding of security to think about what about other kinds of threats that might rise to the level of extraordinary problems, security problems, uh, not because there's some external actor trying to do us harm, but that the severity of the impacts are commensurate with what we think of as security problems. So that's what I mean by security is extreme impacts on society that uh, uh, command attention like we would think about of armed external attacks.
Awesome. And what drew you into this field?
Accidentally, 20 plus years ago, I had a fellowship at the Brookings Institution, and uh, Kofi Annan, then UN Secretary General, asked a colleague of mine to write a paper on what would climate change mean for the UN system. And so he drafted me as a graduate student to co-author with him this paper, and that changed my life.
Wow, that's awesome. All right. So what do you find most exciting about your job?
Well, I mean, in general, the ability to ask and answer questions that I find interesting that are kind of related to this field, but a bit adjacent. So for the 15 years or so, I focused on what were the security consequences of climate impacts, thinking about the risks of conflict or humanitarian emergencies that might come from the things that we expect to see and are already seeing with climate change, like wildfires, droughts, floods, cyclone impacts that are more severe, all those kinds of things. In the last 5 to 10 years, I've been thinking more about the security impacts of responses to climate change, like the efforts to find critical minerals to make electric vehicle batteries, and how those kinds of responses to climate change could become sources of conflict, either at the local level or in terms of geopolitical tension between the US and China.
So what have international security scholars found on climate change that you think are the most exciting findings?
Well, there was the interesting thing about international relations scholars is often we kind of study the questions that we're able to study. So the things that were most tractable early in this space were about whether or not climate change would cause conflict. And that was a fun debate to be part of for 10 or so years. And the findings were ultimately mixed, like under certain circumstances, maybe the climate can contribute mostly to civil wars or social conflict, communal conflict, particularly in agriculturally dependent societies, those that had low state capacity, that had political systems that marginalized some groups and provided benefits to others. Those were some interesting findings. But the other side of the coin is trying to think about, okay, the most exciting work that's emergent in this space is we know that those risks are likely to grow in the future as climate becomes more severe. Uh, what can we, is there something we can do about that? And so there's a whole emergent literature on environmental peace building. I'm not working as much in that space, but I'm on an editorial board of a new journal that a lot of the folks who are writing on that space are now on the frontier of where the field is.
Awesome. All right. So where's it going? Speaking of the frontiers, where do you think the coolest work is yet to be done?
Well, so these questions about how can we prevent the worst impacts of climate change from happening? I think that's where some of the most exciting work is. And some of that is about this environmental peace building side of things, but it's also recognizing that the impacts of climate change that we worry about, like large-scale humanitarian emergencies that could kill uh, thousands, those aren't inevitable. That just because there's an extreme weather event doesn't make it a disaster. What makes something a disaster is the failure of public policy to prepare for those emergencies. And one of the most fascinating things that we found around the world is that, countries like Bangladesh, who are relatively poor, right, who have long been exposed to climate hazards, but and have faced them and have had terrible consequences in the past, they've gotten a lot better at it with modest investments in disaster risk reduction and early warning systems. And with just a modicum of outside help, they've been able to reduce what uh, fatalities that once killed hundreds of thousands, now hardly anybody dies. And so that's where both the exciting research is headed, is to being able to understand under what conditions are we able to avoid these worst consequences of climate change. And that's also exciting work because it directly affects the practice around the world, and we're able to see that uh, we don't have to accept that climate impacts are necessarily going to be worst case scenarios. We can do a lot to prevent them from happening.
Awesome. Are there any great success stories? You see a lot of the paper, things aren't going well. Lots of news is about why we shouldn't have any hope. What do you see?
So there are kind of two sides of this. One is this success story like Bangladesh in preparing for extreme weather events. And there's another side of it, which is the challenge of decarbonization or moving away from fossil fuels. And that's a slower story. Obviously, there's certain setbacks in the US. I've been spending a lot of my time over the last few years thinking about US-China relations in this space. And China's transformation in this area is remarkable. They almost 50% of new vehicle sales in China are electric vehicles of some sort. And don't get me wrong, they have a lot of problems. They're heavily dependent upon coal, but they have become the sort of clean tech makers for the world, which has some benefits in that they're making so much of this stuff now that they're both deploying it on orders of magnitude higher than the US, which is a hopeful story for their ability to bring their emissions down. But also they're selling that technology around the world. And now, from a kind of US-China geostrategic perspective, that has some negative properties to it in that, it may boost their economy and the US may feel like it's falling behind. And there's some aspects of that that are real, but it's also making clean energy and clean transport more affordable for more people all around the world. And that's ultimately what we're going to need. And so we've got to try and reconcile those tensions about Chinese dominance of this issue space in manufacturing with the need for affordable, clean energy. And uh, I have mixed feelings about that, but that's at least a hopeful story that countries like Ethiopia and others are going to be able to leapfrog. They're not going to be having uh, internal combustion engines as they have more widespread take up of automobiles. They're going to go for the next best thing, and that's future technologies, which is electric vehicles. So I'm hopeful about that. Uh, with some, concerns about what that all means for the U.S. role in this space, particularly as we're pulling back from our commitments to clean tech.
Josh, just out of curiosity, if you could talk to me about, in the Cold War, we talked about gaps. What would
Yeah.
happen if a gap opened up between China and the United States in green tech? What great power politics consequence might that have?
So I think the real gap is in terms of the battery technology space, where China is uh, at the technological frontier. We used to be at the technological frontier in the United States. Most of the technologies that China is now commercializing were invented in the US. And so, as China deploys batteries at scale across a range of industries, including in energy storage and in electric vehicles and drones, they will be able to battery technology is becoming like semiconductors. It has so many applications, and the U.S. is kind of sitting on its hands a bit at the moment because it wants to kind of retain sort of early 20th century technologies. And that's just not where we need to be. And so that gap will mean that the US ultimately is going to be relatively poor for it. These choices to try to hold on to both the internal combustion engine and fossil fuel technologies will just put the US at a relative disadvantage. So we're going to be poor for it. And money's fungible. Fungible, you can convert that money that you're making from clean technology into military assets. So I think at the end of the day, in terms of geostrategic distance, the US is going to find itself set back at a time when most of the infrastructure that's needed for the clean technology world that we're going to see um, hasn't been built yet, right? And so countries around the world are going to need energy storage. They're going to embrace renewables because it's the cheapest form of energy now. And the U.S. should be part of that effort rather than sitting on our hands.
So in terms of war fighting, does green tech, is it an asset or a liability?
So
I mean, right now, probably a liability, but if looking out of the horizon 5 or 10 years, what do you see?
I almost want to get us away from thinking about it as green tech. It's just tech, right? It's batteries, right? And even the production of batteries is not always clean, right? Obviously, you have to source the minerals from somewhere, and mining tends to be a dirty industry. But if you need batteries for drones, that's not clean tech per se. It's just batteries for drones. And um, so I think the challenge we have to think about in this space is. Uh, if you're going to fight like a battle in the Pacific over Taiwan, how are you going to get fuel to the fight? We're not going to have conventional distribution of oil in the same way that you had overland in some battle in either Afghanistan or Iraq with like convoys of vehicles. It's probably going to be of a different nature. And some hybridized military technology that's still relying on fossil fuels for some of it, but maybe increasingly has a companion with rechargeable batteries that you have to go back and charge somewhere. That's probably also going to be relevant to a warfighting context. And I don't think we fully know what that looks like yet, but it's going to be different kind of future conflict scenario, and how we think about providing energy to that context is probably not going to be fully fossil fuel or fully electric for quite a long time. But whatever kind of conflict it is, batteries will probably be increasingly integral to any conflict scenario.
In terms of diplomatic statecraft, do you see a lot of soft power in the ability of China to attract or convert other states to align with it because of its possession of an advantage in that sector?
I think a lot of countries are reluctant to choose between the US and China, and so they want to hedge if at all possible. But their financial flows previously through Belt and Road, but now through their new studies that came out that were about their expansive commercial flows and clean tech investments from firms like BYD and the battery maker CATL, that those are so extensive that it has some, it's not quite clear, like the whole Belt and Road initiative might have had some soft power properties to it, but it was also locally resented in some of the country contexts where they operated because there was a bit high-handed. It's not quite clear what the model of interaction that these private firms that are have some basis of state support, what they're doing exactly in terms of like how much local employment are they generating, how much local buy-in do they have. But there's the sense that it could redound to China's benefit in the future. But that story is one that has really picked up in the last 3 or 4 years, and it probably will ultimately be a more mixed portrait. Like some of the like Goshen is a Chinese battery maker, and they have a plant that they're setting up in Illinois, and they also have one in Michigan. The one in Illinois seems to be more successful, but there's a lot of local pushback in the community in Michigan. So I think it's an open question about how much soft power or sort of attractive benefit China as a country will receive from these overseas foreign direct investment.
All right, Josh, our time is almost up. Before we go, is there anything we haven't covered that you want to mention that might be of interest to the listeners?
I think the lasting portrait I'd want to give the listeners is that, we sometimes think of climate change as an environmental problem, but climate change touches on so many facets of human life and international relations that we almost need to rescue it from being seen as something that the environmentalists over there have to deal with. It's something that we're all going to deal with. We all are going to be living with the impacts of climate change and the responses to climate change in terms of the new technologies that have been unleashed because we know we have to decarbonize, that's just going to change so many aspects of our lives, that it's going to revolutionize how we heat and light our homes, how we move ourselves about. And that revolution is coming. And I'm excited by it. I would have been more excited by it a few years ago when it looked like it was going to be happening here in the US pretty quickly. We've got some setbacks, but I feel like the the direction of travel, whether or not some folks around the country realize it, is clear, and whether or not we ultimately acknowledge it is an open question. I'd like to think that we will. Certainly, other countries have, like China, and we're going to watch the space.
Oh, that's a great message. Thanks, Josh, for joining us. We've been very lucky to have you, and tune in next time for another episode of Frontiers of International Security.